Just 5 years after World War II, the most legendary fighter plane ever built was on the verge of disappearing forever. The P-51 Mustang, America's hero of the skies, was suddenly being piled into massive scrap heaps and crushed under bulldozers as if its wartime glory meant nothing. But the real story of what happened to these aircraft after World War II is far more astonishing than their destruction. In 1945, as victory celebrations echoed around the world, American airfields were jam-packed with thousands of P-51s, each worth the equivalent of more than $500,000 today. These were the fighters that escorted bombers deep into Nazi territory, outmaneuvered Messerschmitts, and shaped the outcome of the war. Yet within months of VE Day, the U.S. military faced an unexpected crisis. What do you do with thousands of elite combat planes when the war they were built for suddenly ends? The immediate post-war period created what military historians call the greatest aircraft surplus in human history. The U.S. had built over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs during the war, and suddenly, almost overnight, they weren't needed anymore. The military's priorities shifted from building more fighters to figuring out how to get rid of the ones they had. Storage costs were enormous, maintenance was expensive, and peacetime budgets were being slashed dramatically. The solution they came up with was both practical and heartbreaking. In what became known as Operation Scrap Heap, thousands of P-51s were systematically destroyed. At airfields across the Pacific, in the Philippines, and even in the continental United States, these magnificent aircraft were stripped of any valuable components and then bulldozed into massive pits. Imagine rows and rows of Mustangs, their sleek aluminum bodies gleaming in the sun, being pushed by heavy machinery into enormous graves. Engines worth thousands of dollars were removed and melted down for scrap metal. Instruments that had guided pilots through life and death missions were torn out and discarded. But here's where the story gets interesting, because not all P-51s met this fate. Some forward-thinking officials recognized that these aircraft might have value beyond their immediate military purpose. A small number were set aside for what they called foreign military assistance, which was essentially an early version of military aid to Allied nations. This decision would prove to be incredibly significant for the Mustang's survival story. The first major destination for surplus P-51s was actually quite surprising. The newly formed Israeli Air Force, desperate for capable fighter aircraft, managed to acquire several dozen Mustangs through various channels. These aircraft became the backbone of Israel's air defense during their 1948 War of Independence. Israeli pilots, many of them World War II veterans themselves, flew these Mustangs against Egyptian Spitfires and Syrian aircraft in some of the most intense aerial combat of the early Cold War period. Meanwhile, in Latin America, countries like Guatemala, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic were receiving P-51s as part of American diplomatic efforts to maintain influence in the region. These nations used their Mustangs primarily for internal security and air shows, but some saw actual combat during various regional conflicts throughout the 1950s and 1960s. The ruggedness that had made the P-51 legendary in World War II served these smaller air forces well in their tropical operating environments. Perhaps the most famous post-war military use of the P-51 came during the Korean War. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in 1950, the United States found itself needing close air support aircraft that could operate from rough airfields and deliver precise ground attacks. The P-51 was perfect for this role. Hundreds of Mustangs were pulled out of storage, refurbished, and shipped to Korea, where they flew thousands of combat sorties against enemy troops, supply lines, and infrastructure. Korean War Mustang pilots faced challenges their World War II predecessors never encountered. Instead of high-altitude dogfights with enemy fighters, they were flying low-level missions against heavily defended ground targets. Anti-aircraft fire was intense, and the mountainous Korean terrain made navigation and emergency landings extremely difficult. Despite these challenges, The P-51 proved remarkably adaptable to its new ground attack role, earning the nickname the Workhorse of Korea from the pilots who flew them. But military service wasn't the only second life awaiting P-51 Mustangs. As surplus aircraft became available to civilian buyers, something unexpected began happening in the United States. Former military pilots, many of them veterans who had flown Mustangs during the war, started purchasing these aircraft for private use. The price was incredibly attractive. You could buy a genuine P-51 Mustang for less than the cost of a new car in the 1950s. This civilian adoption created the foundation for what would eventually become the Warbird restoration movement. Early civilian owners faced significant challenges, though. Parts were becoming scarce, maintenance manuals were classified, and finding mechanics who understood the complex Merlin engine was nearly impossible. Many of these early civilian Mustangs were modified extensively, with some being converted for air racing, while others were transformed into high-speed personal aircraft for wealthy enthusiasts. The air racing scene of the 1960s and 1970s became dominated by modified P-51s. The famous Reno air races featured multiple classes of Mustang racers, each one pushing the boundaries of what these World War II fighters could achieve. Pilots like Bob Hoover and Chuck Yeager became legends not just for their test pilot work, but for their incredible demonstrations in restored P-51s at air shows across the country. During this same period, Hollywood discovered the cinematic appeal of the P-51 Mustang. Movies like 12 O'Clock High and The Battle of Britain featured real Mustangs in aerial sequences that captured the drama and excitement of World War II air combat. This exposure helped maintain public interest in these aircraft and contributed to their growing status as symbols of American aviation achievement. The 1980s marked a turning point in P-51 preservation efforts. As the original generation of World War II veterans began reaching retirement age, many became passionate about preserving the aircraft they had flown in combat. Organizations like the Confederate Air Force, later renamed the Commemorative Air Force, began systematic efforts to locate, restore, and maintain flying examples of wartime aircraft, with the P-51 being one of their primary focuses. This preservation movement faced enormous challenges. By the 1980s, many P-51s had been sitting in backyards, farm fields, and airport corners for decades. Corrosion had taken its toll, engines were seized, and finding original parts had become increasingly difficult. The knowledge of how to properly restore these aircraft was disappearing as the original mechanics and engineers aged. Despite these obstacles, dedicated volunteers began what can only be described as archaeological restoration projects, bringing P-51s back from the brink of complete deterioration. The economic boom of the 1990s brought new resources to P-51 restoration efforts. Wealthy collectors and corporations began investing serious money in bringing these aircraft back to flying condition. Companies specializing in warbird restoration emerged, employing teams of skilled craftsmen who could fabricate parts, rebuild engines, and restore these aircraft to better-than-new condition. The cost was substantial. A complete P-51 restoration could easily exceed $2 million, but the results were spectacular. Today's P-51 restoration projects represent some of the finest aircraft maintenance work being done anywhere in the world. Modern restorers have access to computer-aided design tools, advanced materials, and manufacturing techniques that weren't available to the original builders. Some restored P-51s are actually more reliable and better built than they were when they rolled off the North American aviation production line in 1944. The current status of P-51 Mustangs worldwide is both encouraging and sobering. Of the original 15,000 aircraft built, fewer than 200 remain in existence, with only about 150 in flying condition. These survivors are scattered across the globe, with the largest concentration in the United States, followed by significant numbers in the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. Each flying P-51 represents hundreds of thousands of dollars in restoration work and ongoing maintenance costs. Modern P-51 owners face unique challenges that their 1950s predecessors couldn't have imagined. Federal Aviation Administration regulations have become increasingly strict, requiring extensive documentation and regular inspections. Insurance costs are astronomical, and finding qualified mechanics who can work on Merlin engines requires connections within a very small community of specialists. Flying a P-51 today requires not just piloting skills, but significant financial resources and mechanical knowledge. The airshow circuit has become the primary venue where the public can experience P-51 Mustangs today. Events like the Experimental Aircraft Association's annual gathering in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, regularly feature multiple flying Mustangs performing formation flights and aerobatic demonstrations. These performances serve multiple purposes. They honor the memory of World War II veterans. They educate younger generations about aviation history. And they provide the financial support necessary to keep these aircraft flying. Perhaps the most significant recent development in P-51 preservation has been the emergence of flight training programs specifically designed to qualify pilots on World War II fighters. Organizations like the Collings Foundation offer comprehensive training courses that teach modern pilots the unique skills required to safely operate these powerful, complex aircraft. These programs are essential for ensuring that qualified pilots will be available to fly P-51s for future generations. The technological legacy of the P-51 extends far beyond the aircraft themselves. Engineering innovations developed for the Mustang influenced civilian aircraft design for decades. The laminar flow wing design pioneered on the P-51 became standard on high-performance aircraft. The integration of the Merlin engine with American manufacturing techniques demonstrated possibilities for international aerospace cooperation that continue today. Educational institutions have also embraced the P-51 as a teaching tool. Aviation schools use restored Mustangs to demonstrate principles of aerodynamics, engine operation, and aircraft systems. Students who might otherwise learn these concepts only in textbooks can see and touch actual examples of World War II engineering excellence. This hands-on learning experience creates deeper understanding and appreciation for aviation history and technology. The international community of P-51 enthusiasts has created a global network of knowledge sharing and mutual support. Owners and restorers from different countries regularly collaborate on projects, sharing technical information, sourcing rare parts, and coordinating joint appearances at air shows. This international cooperation ensures that expertise and resources are maximized for. What if I told you that the most legendary fighter plane of World War II almost completely vanished from the skies just a few years after helping win the war? The P-51 Mustang, the aircraft that dominated the European theater and turned the tide of aerial combat, faced a fate that would shock anyone who witnessed its wartime glory. Today, we're diving deep into the untold story of what really happened to these magnificent machines after the victory parades ended and the world tried to return to normal. Picture this. It's 1,945, and thousands of P-51 Mustangs are scattered across air bases from England to the Pacific. These weren't just any airplanes. They were the cream of American aviation engineering, each one representing cutting-edge technology and countless hours of skilled craftsmanship. But within just a few short years, most of these incredible machines would meet a fate that seems almost criminal by today's standards. What happened next is a story of rapid technological change, economic pressures, and decisions that would haunt aviation enthusiasts for decades to come. The immediate aftermath of World War II created a massive problem that military planners hadn't fully anticipated. The United States had built an enormous war machine, and suddenly, with peace declared, they found themselves with thousands upon thousands of military aircraft that were no longer needed. The P-51 Mustang, despite being one of the most effective fighters ever created, was caught up in this post-war reckoning. The military faced a simple but devastating question. What do you do with all these planes? The numbers were staggering. By war's end, over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs had rolled off production lines. These weren't just sitting in storage. They represented millions of dollars in investment and materials. But the rapid pace of technological development meant that even these advanced fighters were quickly becoming obsolete. Jet engines were the future, and propeller-driven aircraft, no matter how sophisticated, suddenly seemed like relics of a bygone era. Military leadership made what seemed like logical decisions at the time, but these choices would prove heartbreaking for future generations. The first wave of Mustangs to disappear were those overseas. Rather than spending enormous sums to ship thousands of aircraft back to the United States, military commanders made the cold calculation that it was more economical to simply destroy them where they stood. Across Europe and the Pacific, Mustangs that had survived combat missions and helped secure victory found themselves facing bulldozers and cutting torches. The scale of this destruction was breathtaking. Entire squadrons of P-51s were pushed into massive piles and scrapped for their aluminum content. Photographs from this period show rows upon rows of pristine Mustangs being systematically destroyed. Images that are difficult to look at today, knowing what these aircraft would be worth both financially and historically. It wasn't malicious. It was simply the brutal economics of post-war demobilization. Back in the United States, the situation was somewhat different, but equally dramatic. The military established what they called surplus disposal programs, attempting to find new uses for the thousands of Mustangs that had returned home. Some aircraft were transferred to Air National Guard units, where they continued serving in a reserve capacity. Others found their way into civilian hands through government surplus sales, though the process was often bureaucratic and limited. The civilian market for military aircraft in the late 1940s was nothing like what we see today. There wasn't an established community of warbird collectors or airshow performers. Most civilians who purchased surplus Mustangs had practical intentions, converting them for racing, agricultural use, or even stripping them for parts. The idea of preserving these aircraft as historical artifacts simply wasn't widespread yet. This led to what aviation historians now call the Great Mustang Diaspora. P-51s scattered across the country, finding new lives in unexpected places. Some became air racers, their military camouflage replaced with bright racing colors and sponsor logos. Others were modified for crop dusting, their gun ports sealed and agricultural equipment installed. A few lucky examples found their way into the hands of enthusiasts who recognized their historical significance, but these were rare exceptions. The racing circuit became one of the most visible post-war destinations for surviving Mustangs. The newly established Reno air races and similar events created demand for high-performance aircraft, and modified P-51s proved incredibly competitive. However, racing took a terrible toll on these historical aircraft. Many were extensively modified, losing their original military configuration forever. Others were lost in racing accidents, their wreckage joining the growing list of vanished Mustangs. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of the post-war Mustang story was how little thought was given to historical preservation. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, World War II felt recent rather than historical. The idea that these aircraft would one day be priceless artifacts seemed absurd to people who had seen thousands of them filling the skies just a few years earlier. This short-sightedness led to decisions that seem almost incomprehensible today. The Korean War briefly changed the calculus for remaining Mustangs. As America found itself in another conflict, some P-51s were pulled back into military service. However, by this time, jet aircraft had proven their superiority, and the Mustang's role was limited. Most served in ground attack missions rather than air-to-air combat, and losses during the conflict further depleted the surviving population. International sales became another significant factor in the Mustang's post-war story. The United States sold or gave hundreds of P-51s to Allied nations as part of military aid packages. Countries like Italy, South Korea, and several Latin American nations operated Mustangs well into the 1950s and beyond. While this gave the aircraft continued operational life, it also scattered them around the globe, making future preservation efforts even more challenging. The civilian aviation boom of the 1950s created new opportunities and new threats for surviving Mustangs. As general aviation expanded, some P-51s were converted for civilian transportation, their military equipment removed, and passenger accommodations installed. Others became corporate aircraft, serving executives who wanted the prestige of flying a famous warbird. However, many of these conversions were irreversible, fundamentally altering the aircraft's historical character. By the early 1960s, the reality of what had been lost was beginning to sink in. Aviation museums were starting to recognize the historical importance of World War II aircraft, but finding intact examples was becoming increasingly difficult. The Smithsonian and other major institutions began actively searching for representative aircraft, but many of the best examples had already been lost to scrap dealers or accidents. The emerging warbird movement of the 1960s and 1970s began to change attitudes toward surviving P-51s. Collectors started to recognize these aircraft as irreplaceable pieces of history, and prices began to reflect their scarcity. This created a new dynamic where surviving Mustangs were increasingly valued for their historical significance rather than just their utility as aircraft. Restoration became both an art and a science, as enthusiasts worked to return modified P-51 seconds to their wartime configuration. This process often required extensive detective work to determine original specifications and the fabrication of parts that were no longer available. Each successful restoration represented not just mechanical achievement, but historical rescue work. The numbers tell a sobering story of attrition. From over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs built during the war, estimates suggest that fewer than 300 complete aircraft survive today. This represents a survival rate of roughly 2%, a staggering loss of historical material that would be unthinkable if it happened today. Each surviving Mustang has become exponentially more valuable both as a historical artifact and as a functioning aircraft. Modern Mustang ownership represents a completely different world from the casual surplus sales of the 1940s. Today's P-51 owners are typically wealthy collectors or museums with the resources to properly maintain these complex machines. The cost of purchasing and operating a Mustang runs into the millions, making them accessible to only a privileged few. This economic reality ensures their preservation, but also limits public access to these historical treasures. The restoration industry that has grown around surviving Mustangs employs some of the most skilled craftspeople in aviation. These specialists can rebuild engines, fabricate missing parts, and return aircraft to flying condition even after decades of neglect or modification. However, each restoration faces the challenge of maintaining historical authenticity while ensuring airworthiness under modern safety standards. Air shows have become the primary venue where the public can experience surviving P-51 Mustangs. These events allow these historical aircraft to fulfill something close to their original purpose, flying demonstrations that showcase their performance capabilities. However, each flight hour adds wear to irreplaceable machines, creating ongoing tension between preservation and public education. The few Mustangs that remain in flying condition have become celebrities in the aviation world. Aircraft like Precious Metal and Voodoo are known by name to enthusiasts, and their appearances at air shows draw crowds of thousands. These flying examples serve as ambassadors for their lost brothers, helping to educate new generations about the aircraft's historical significance. Museums worldwide have worked to preserve static examples of P-51 Mustangs though even these face ongoing conservation challenges. Aluminum corrosion, fabric deterioration, and the gradual degradation of rubber and plastic components require constant attention. Museum conservators have developed sophisticated techniques for preserving these aircraft, but the work is expensive and never-ending. International recovery efforts have occasionally yielded unexpected discoveries. Mustangs have been recovered from crash sites, retrieved from foreign military service, and even found in barns, where they were stored and forgotten. Each recovery represents a small victory in the larger story of preservation, though the condition of these aircraft varies dramatically. The legacy of the post-war Mustang story extends beyond just these specific aircraft. The massive disposal of military assets after World War II established patterns that would be repeated after subsequent conflicts, though later generations would be more conscious of historical preservation. The lessons learned from the Mustang diaspora have influenced how military surplus is handled today. Modern computer modeling and documentation efforts are working to preserve the technical legacy of the P-51, even if the physical aircraft cannot all be saved. Detailed engineering drawings, performance data, and maintenance procedures are being digitized and preserved for future researchers and restoration projects. This work ensures that knowledge about these aircraft will survive even if more of the physical examples are lost. The story of what happened to P-51 Mustangs after World War II serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of historical preservation. It demonstrates how quickly significant artifacts can be lost when their historical value isn't immediately recognized. The few hundred surviving Mustangs represent not just mechanical marvels but symbols of an entire generation's sacrifice and achievement. Today, every flying P-51 Mustang carries the weight of representing thousands of lost siblings. When these aircraft take to the skies at air shows or private events, they're not just demonstrating their own capabilities, but honoring the memory of all the Mustangs that didn't survive the post-war years. Their distinctive sound and graceful performance provide a direct connection to one of history's most significant periods. The current state of P-51 preservation represents both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, in that dedicated individuals and organizations have saved what they could from the post-war disposal programs. Tragedy in the recognition of how much was lost due to short-sightedness and economic pressures. Each surviving Mustang is precious precisely because so many of its contemporaries are gone forever. The Mustang's post-war story reminds us that historical preservation requires foresight and resources that aren't always available during periods of rapid change. The men and women who made the decisions to scrap thousands of these aircraft weren't villains. They were dealing with immediate practical challenges using the information and resources available to them. However, their choices created consequences that aviation historians and enthusiasts are still living with today. So the next time you hear the distinctive roar of a Merlin engine overhead or see the elegant lines of a P-51 Mustang at an air show, remember that you're witnessing something truly rare. You're seeing one of the few survivors of what was once a mighty fleet, a living connection to a pivotal moment in world history when these aircraft helped secure freedom for future generations. The story of what happened to the P-51 after World War II is ultimately a story about the fragility of history itself and the precious nature of the artifacts that connect us to our past.